Sometimes the most unexpected shelter comes from the most unlikely stranger. In the winter of 1882, schoolteacher Clara Whitmore found herself trapped in a mountain blizzard with nowhere to turn. That's when Gideon Lawson appeared, a giant cowboy who stood 6'8" and spoke with the authority of a man who tamed wild horses and wilder land. His cabin was warm, his offer was bold, and his words were unforgettable. "You'll warm my bed tonight, and I'll build you a ranch tomorrow." Clara had two choices: freeze to death in the storm, or trust this mountain of a man with her life. She chose warmth. What happened next would test everything she believed about love, survival, and second chances. But when spring came and the snow melted away, would a refined Eastern teacher really stay with a rough cowboy who promised her the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Whitmore had not imagined her journey west would end in a stranger's cabin, clutching her worn leather teaching satchel like a lifeline. The bag held everything that remained of her former life: a few precious books, her mother's letters, lesson plans she'd written with such hope back in Philadelphia, and the silver pen her students had given her as a farewell gift. Now it seemed like relics from another world entirely. The cabin surprised her. She'd expected squalor, the kind of rough living she'd heard stories about from other women who'd ventured into the territories. Instead, Gideon's home spoke of quiet care and unexpected thoughtfulness. The floor was swept clean. The windows, though small, sparkled in the firelight. Hand-hewn furniture showed the marks of patient craftsmanship, and the stone fireplace drew smoke cleanly up its chimney. Everything had its place, from the neat stack of split wood by the hearth to the row of books, actual books, lined up on a shelf he'd built into the wall. "You read?" Clara said, surprise evident in her voice as she examined the spines. Cooper, Irving, even a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, their pages well worn from handling. Gideon moved about the cabin with surprising grace for such a large man, banking the fire and setting a kettle to boil. "Some," he replied, his voice carrying that same rumbling quality that had cut through the blizzard. "Winter nights get long up here. A man needs something to fill the quiet." She watched him work, noting how his massive hands handled delicate tasks, adjusting the flame, measuring tea leaves, folding a blanket with military precision. Everything about him contradicted her expectations. Cowboys were supposed to be rough, crude, given to drinking and fighting. This man moved with the careful consideration of someone who'd learned to live alone without becoming uncivilized. "You've been up here long?" Clara asked, settling onto the wooden chair he'd indicated. The seat was padded with a cushion made from what looked like deer hide, stitched with neat, even seams. 3 years, Gideon said, pouring hot water into 2 tin cups. "Built this place with my own hands, every board, every stone." He handed her a cup, their fingers brushing briefly. His skin was rough with calluses but surprisingly warm. Figured it was time to stop wandering and start building something that would last. The tea was good, better than she'd expected. Real. A tea, not the bitter substitute she'd grown accustomed to during her travels. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting its warmth seep into her fingers while she studied this man who'd appeared out of the storm like something from a fairy. "Tale, what brought you to teaching?" Gideon asked, settling into the chair across from her. It was built larger than normal furniture, clearly made to accommodate his considerable frame. "My father," Clara said, surprised by her own willingness to share. "He believed education could change the world, one child at a time. When he died, I felt called to carry on his work." She paused, remembering. "My mother thought it was foolish for a woman to travel alone to teach in frontier schools. She wanted me to marry Mr. Henderson. He owns a textile mill back home. But you came anyway." "I came anyway." Clara met his eyes, finding them clearer and more intelligent than she'd first noticed. "Though I'm beginning to wonder if my mother was right about the foolishness part." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. On the shelf behind him, Clara noticed a small wooden cross, simply carved but sanded smooth from handling. It sat beside his books like a quiet testament to faith maintained in solitude. Teaching's important work, he said finally. Kids out here don't get much chance at learning unless someone like you comes along. Takes courage to leave everything familiar and head into the unknown. Or stupidity, Clara said with a self-deprecating laugh. I'm not entirely sure which. Courage, Gideon said firmly. Stupid people don't make it as far as you did before running into trouble. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows and sending snow cascading down the chimney to hiss against the flames. Clara shivered, remembering the bone-deep cold that had been seeping into her very soul before Gideon found her. The bed, she said quietly, her cheeks warming despite the gravity of their situation. Your offer was about survival, nothing more, Gideon said, his tone gentle but matter-of-fact. Up here, cold kills faster than anything else. I've got blankets enough for both of us, and the fire will keep burning all night, but shared. Warmth is the difference between waking up tomorrow and not, Clara nodded, understanding the practical necessity, even as her Eastern upbringing rebelled against the impropriety. And the ranch? You meant that too? Gideon's expression grew serious, almost vulnerable. I've got near 2,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. Good water, natural windbreaks, timber for building, been working it alone, but... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. A place like this, it's meant to be shared, meant for family. You don't even know me, Clara said softly. Know enough. Gideon's eyes held hers steadily. Know you're brave enough to come west alone. Know you care about teaching children. Know you've got sand enough to trust a stranger in a storm rather than give up and die. He gestured toward her satchel. Know you value learning, same as I do. That's more than most people know about each other when they marry. The word hung between them, bold and impossible, and somehow right. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the fire or the hot tea. I should tell you, she said, I'm not particularly suited to frontier life. I can't cook much beyond basic meals. I've never gardened, and I certainly don't know anything about ranching. Can you learn? I can learn. Then we'll figure out the rest as we go. Gideon stood, moving to a chest near the foot of his bed. I've got extra blankets here. We can string up a line, give you privacy for changing. Morning will come, and we'll see what the weather brings. As Clara prepared for sleep in this strange new world, she found herself thinking not about the impropriety of the situation, but about the unexpected gentleness of this giant man who'd saved her life. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, she felt safer than she had in months of traveling. Gideon settled onto his side of the large bed, careful to maintain respectful distance, even as they shared the warmth that would keep them both. Alive through the long mountain night, Clara lay rigid at first, acutely aware of his presence, but gradually the exhaustion of her ordeal overtook her. Just before sleep claimed her, she heard him speak quietly into the darkness. Clara, yes, welcome, home. A week passed in the mountain cabin, and Clara began to understand that her situation had shifted from temporary shelter to something far more significant. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached the cabin's windows. More importantly, she was beginning to see Gideon Lawson as something other than her rescuer. He was becoming the most intriguing man she'd ever encountered. Each morning, Gideon rose before dawn to tend his livestock, returning with fresh milk and eggs that somehow appeared despite the harsh conditions. He cooked breakfast with competent hands, never making her feel helpless, but clearly taking pleasure in caring for her. Their conversations over morning coffee had become the highlight of her days, ranging from books they'd both read to dreams they'd never shared with anyone else. Tell me about this land of yours, Clara said on the 7th morning, watching him. repair a leather harness with the same patient skill he applied to everything. Gideon's eyes lit up in a way she'd learned to recognize. Come spring, when the snow melts, you'll see valley grass so green it hurts to look at. Creek runs year-round, never goes dry even in the worst summers. Timber on the north slope, good for building and fuel. And the view... He paused, looking, almost embarrassed by his own enthusiasm. Sounds foolish, maybe, but there's a spot up on the ridge where you can see clear to the next territory. Makes a person feel like they're part of something bigger. Clara found herself imagining it. This place he described with such love. How did you come to own so much land? Bought it fair and square from a man who couldn't make it work, Gideon said. Takes more than wanting to succeed out here. Takes understanding the land, respecting what it can give and what it can't. He finished a particularly intricate stitch and held up the harness to examine his work. Takes staying power too. Most folks want everything to happen quick. The land teaches you patience, or it breaks you trying. That afternoon, Clara made a discovery that changed everything. While Gideon was outside splitting wood, she decided to organize her teaching satchel, which had become scattered during her frantic arrival. As she carefully folded her mother's letters, her fingers encountered the small, velvet pouch she always carried in the bag's innermost pocket. Her mother's wedding ring. Clara drew it out slowly, the delicate gold band catching the firelight. She'd carried it for 3 years now, ever since her mother's death, unable to wear it, but unwilling to leave it behind. It represented everything she'd lost. The secure life in Philadelphia, the loving marriage her parents had shared, the conventional future that had been mapped out for her. You've got something troubling you, Gideon said when he returned, stomping snow from his boots. His perception continued to surprise her. Clara held up the ring, letting it catch the light. My mother's wedding ring. She wore it for 32 years, never took it off except to clean it. She turned the band slowly, remembering. She used to tell me that marriage was like tending a garden. It required daily attention, patience, and faith that what you planted would grow into something beautiful. Gideon hung up his coat and moved to sit across from her, his expression serious. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. She also would have been horrified by my current situation. Clara met his eyes directly. Unmarried woman, living alone, with a man she's known for a week. In her world, such behavior would have ruined me completely. And in your world? Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering. I'm beginning to think my world has changed more than I realized. The teaching position you were heading to, Gideon said carefully. You could still make it there when the road's clear, probably lose only a month of the school term. The statement hung between them like a challenge. Clara realized that for the first time since arriving at his cabin, Gideon was giving her a clear path back to her original plan. The generous thing, the proper thing, would be to take it. Is that what you think I should do? She asked. I think. You should do what makes you happy, Gideon said, but I'd be lying if I said I wanted you to go. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness. Somewhere out there lay the town where she was expected, the schoolhouse she was meant to run, the respectable life she'd planned. Behind her sat a man who'd offered her something entirely different, uncertain, unconventional, but somehow more real than anything she'd ever been offered before. What would marriage to you be like? She asked without turning around. She heard him shift in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Honest, he said finally. I'm not a man who knows how to put on pretenses. What you see is what you'd get, the good and the bad of it. I work hard, I keep my word, and I'd never raise a hand to you in anger. But I'm rough around the edges, Clara. I don't know fancy manners or how to talk to society people. Clara turned back to face him. What about children? Want them? Gideon said simply. Want them more than I knew, until I started thinking about having them with you. The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. And my teaching? Kids around here need schooling badly. We could build a proper schoolhouse, get the neighboring families to contribute. You'd have your students, just not the ones you originally planned for. Clara looked down at the ring in her palm, its familiar weight somehow comforting and constraining at once. Her mother had worn it as a symbol of a love that grew slowly, steadily, over decades of shared challenges and quiet devotion. Clara had always assumed she'd find something similar, safe, predictable, socially acceptable. But Gideon was offering her something entirely different. Not safety, but adventure. Not predictability, but possibility. Not social acceptance, but a chance to build something entirely her own. "If I stayed," she said carefully, "if I chose this life with you, there would be no going back. No returning to Philadelphia if things got difficult. No retreat to respectability if the frontier proved too hard." "No going back," Gideon agreed. "But Clara, building something worthwhile always requires burning bridges. Question is whether you're ready to stop looking backward and start looking ahead." That night, Clara lay in the darkness, listening to Gideon's quiet breathing and turning the ring over and over in her fingers. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to pick up again, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded like change coming, inevitable and necessary. By morning, she had made her choice. "Gideon," she said as they shared breakfast, "about that ranch you promised to build me." He looked up from his coffee, hope and wariness warring in his expression. Clara slipped her mother's ring onto her right hand, where it caught the morning light streaming through the cabin windows. "I think I'd like to see those plans." Spring arrived with the determination of a woman who'd made up her mind. Clara watched from the cabin doorway as Gideon surveyed the land with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, his father's hammer hanging from his belt like a badge of office. The tool was worn smooth from decades of use, its head darkened with age and honest work, its handle shaped by generations of capable hands. "My grandfather carried this hammer when he built his first house in Ohio," Gideon had told her the night before, running his thumb along the familiar grooves. "My father used it to build our family home, and barns for half the county besides. Now it's going to help us build something that'll last long after we're gone." The snow had finally melted enough to reveal the full scope of Gideon's holdings, and Clara found herself amazed by what she saw. Rolling pasture land stretched in every direction, broken by stands of timber and crossed by a creek that sparkled in the morning sun. The cabin where they'd weathered the storm sat on a small rise, perfectly positioned to overlook the valley while staying protected from the worst weather. "The house will go there," Gideon said, pointing to a flat expanse about 100 yards. "From the creek, close enough to the water for convenience, high enough to stay dry during spring runoff. We'll orient it to catch the morning sun, but stay cool in the afternoon heat." Clara could see it in her mind, a proper house with real windows, multiple rooms, maybe even a covered porch where she could sit and watch the seasons change. "How long will it take to build?" "If I work alone, the better part of 2 years," Gideon said. "But I'm hoping I won't be working alone." That afternoon, their first visitors arrived, a weathered man named Samuel Hartwell and his teenage son, Danny. The Hartwells ran a smaller spread about 10 miles east, and they'd ridden over as soon as the trails cleared to check on their reclusive neighbor. "Heard you might have company up here, Gideon," Samuel said, tipping his hat respectfully to Clara. His eyes were curious but not judgmental, a man used to the frontier's flexible approach to conventional propriety. "Clara Whitmore," Gideon said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Clara's heart skip. "She's going to be my wife, and she's going to teach school for the Valley children." Danny Hartwell, a lanky boy of perhaps 16, perked up immediately. "School? Actual school with books and writing and everything?" "Everything," Clara assured him, charmed by his enthusiasm. "How long has it been since you've had proper lessons?" "Never had proper lessons," Danny admitted. "Ma taught me letters and numbers, but she passed 2 years back. Been trying to learn on my own since then, but it's hard going." Clara felt that familiar stirring she always experienced when meeting a young person hungry for knowledge. "What would you like to learn most?" "Reading," Danny said immediately. "I can puzzle out words fine, but I want to read books. Real books, like the ones Ma used to talk about. And writing. Want to be able to write letters that don't look like chicken scratches. We'll start with reading, Clara promised. I have some books that would be perfect for you. Samuel Hartwell watched this exchange with growing interest. There's 8 families in this valley, Miss Whitmore, and near 20 children between them all. Most of them haven't seen a proper teacher in their lives. You'd have eager students, that's certain, and willing help with the building, Gideon added. Nothing brings neighbors together like a barn raising, especially when there's going to be a schoolhouse at the end of it. Over the following weeks, Clara discovered that Gideon's promise of community support wasn't idle talk. As word spread through the valley that Gideon Lawson was finally building a proper homestead and that he'd found himself a schoolteacher bride, families began appearing with offers of help and barely concealed curiosity about the woman who'd captured the attention of their most eligible bachelor. Clara learned that Gideon's reputation in the area was sterling. A man who kept his word, helped neighbors in need, and never started trouble, but could certainly finish it if necessary. The women were initially reserved, unsure what to make of an Eastern lady who'd agreed to marry a man after knowing him for barely a month. But Clara's genuine warmth and her obvious commitment to teaching their children quickly won them over. "You're not what I expected," admitted Margaret Hartwell, Samuel's wife, as they worked together to prepare a community dinner. "When Samuel said Gideon had found himself a city woman, I figured she'd be all airs and complaints about the rough living. The rough living is growing on me," Clara said truthfully, kneading bread dough with increasing confidence. "There's something satisfying about work that produces immediate, tangible results, but it wasn't all harmonious. The first real test of their partnership came during their second week of building, when Clara suggested modifications to Gideon's house plans. "The kitchen should be larger," she said, studying the dimensions he'd laid out, "and we need proper storage for books and school supplies. Also, the front room should have built-in shelving." "Clara," Gideon interrupted, his voice carrying a note of strained patience. "I've been planning this house for 3 years. Every measurement, every beam, every window placement has been thought through. We can't just start changing things now." "But surely you can see that a larger kitchen makes sense," Clara pressed. "If I'm going to be cooking for work crews and hosting community gatherings, the kitchen is plenty big enough," Gideon said firmly. "Any bigger and it'll be impossible to heat in winter." They stared at each other across the foundation stakes, the first real conflict of their relationship crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Clara felt her Eastern sensibilities rising. Back home, her opinion on domestic arrangements would have been not just welcomed but expected. Here, apparently, Gideon's practical experience trumped her preferences. "Fine," she said coolly. "It's your house, after all." "Our house," Gideon corrected, his voice softening. "Clara, I'm not trying to dismiss your ideas, but I know this land, this climate. I know what works and what doesn't. Trust me on this." That evening, they worked in stiff silence until Danny Hartwell arrived with a question about a passage in one of Clara's books. Watching her patience with the boy, seeing how naturally she shifted into teaching mode, Gideon realized something important. "You're right about the kitchen," he said after Danny left. "And the book storage. I was thinking like a bachelor, not like a man building a home for a family." Clara looked up from the lesson plans she was preparing. "And I was thinking like someone who's never had to heat a house with a wood stove," she admitted. "Maybe we both need to bend a little." "Maybe we do," Gideon agreed. He pulled out his father's hammer and began sketching revised plans in the dirt. "Show me what you had in mind." Clara's copy of Pride and Prejudice had survived 3 years of travel, countless readings, and now served as the bridge between 2 very different worlds. The leather cover was worn soft as silk, the pages marked with pressed flowers from her mother's garden and marginalia in Clara's careful script. It was, she realized, the perfect tool for teaching Gideon that books could be more than simple entertainment. "I don't see the point," Gideon said on a warm May evening, holding the novel as if it might bite him. "All this talking and dancing." And worrying about who's got money and who doesn't. People have real problems to solve. That's exactly why it matters, Clara said, settling beside him on the porch steps of their half-built house. The walls were up now and the roof nearly complete, but they were still living in the cabin while finishing work continued. Elizabeth Bennet has real problems. She's trying to find her place in a world that values women only for their marriageability and their connections. Sound familiar? Gideon glanced at her sideways. You comparing yourself to a character in a story? I'm comparing every woman who's ever had to choose between security and happiness, Clara said. Elizabeth could have married Mr. Collins and been comfortable but miserable, or she could wait for something real, even if it meant taking a risk. Just like I could have married Mr. Henderson back in Philadelphia, or waited for something better, like a giant cowboy in a snowstorm. Gideon's mouth quirked in the half-smile she'd grown to love. Like a giant cowboy who builds houses and reads Shakespeare, Clara corrected, though I notice you're still struggling with Jane Austen. Gideon opened the book and read aloud, his deep voice lending unexpected gravity to Elizabeth's sharp dialogue. I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. He paused, considering. She's got backbone, I'll give her that. Keep reading, Clara encouraged. As spring progressed into summer, their evening reading sessions became as routine as morning coffee. Clara discovered that Gideon's reading difficulties weren't about intelligence. His comprehension was excellent once he worked through the words. Rather, his education had been practical, focused on survival skills rather than literary refinement. Teaching him became another way of building their life together. The community barn raising for their house brought everyone in the valley together, and Clara got her first real taste of how frontier society judged newcomers. Most of the women welcomed her warmly, eager for another educated voice in their isolated community. But Martha Kelman, wife of a neighboring rancher, made her disapproval clear from the start. Mighty quick courtship, Martha observed loudly enough for several women to hear as they worked together preparing the midday meal for the work crews. In my day, decent folks took time to get properly acquainted before making such permanent arrangements. In your day, Mrs. Kelman, people probably didn't have blizzards making the choice for them, Clara replied evenly, continuing to slice ham for sandwiches. Sometimes circumstances help clarify what the heart already knows. Circumstances, Martha sniffed. That's a fancy way of putting it. Clara felt her temper rise, but forced herself to remain calm. She was still the newcomer here, still proving herself to this community. But before she could frame a diplomatic response, Margaret Hartwell spoke up. Martha, you married your husband after knowing him 6 weeks, and that was during planting season when you had plenty of time to think it over. Clara and Gideon were facing life and death. Seems to me that tells you more about a person's character than 6 months of Sunday dinners. The other women murmured agreement, and Martha had the grace to look embarrassed. But Clara realized that her acceptance wasn't complete. She would need to prove herself not just as Gideon's choice, but as a valuable member of their community. That afternoon, she got her chance. Young Danny Hartwell approached her during a break in the construction work, a worn book clutched in his hands. Miss Clara, I've been working through this book like you suggested, but there's words I can't puzzle out, he said, showing her a copy of Robinson Crusoe. Clara sat down with him on a pile of lumber, and within minutes they were deep in discussion about Crusoe's resourcefulness and the parallels between surviving on a desert island and thriving on the frontier. Other children drifted over, drawn by the animated conversation, and soon Clara found herself conducting an impromptu lesson with 8 young people ranging in age from 6 to 16. That's how you build a shelter when you don't have proper tools, explained 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell, relating Crusoe's construction methods to her own father's work. You use what you have and make it strong enough to last. Just like what Mr. Gideon's doing with your house, added her younger brother, using the land and the materials to build something that belongs here. Clara watched their eager faces and felt that familiar joy of seeing young minds make connections. That's exactly right. Crusoe succeeds because he learns to work with his environment instead of fighting against it. What other examples can you think of from your own lives? The discussion continued for nearly an hour, touching on literature, practical skills, and the philosophical questions that arise when people are forced to create new lives in challenging circumstances. Clara noticed that the adult conversations had quieted, parents and neighbors listening to their children engage with ideas in ways they'd never witnessed before. When the impromptu lesson ended and the children scattered back to their families, Samuel Hartwell approached Clara with a thoughtful expression. "That was something to see," he said. "Danny's been trying to work through that book for months, getting frustrated and giving up. 20 minutes with you and suddenly he's talking about themes and meanings like a college student. He's a bright boy," Clara said. "They all are. They just need someone to show them how to think about what they're reading, not just decode the words." "The Valley needs this," Samuel said seriously. "We've been raising children who can work hard and survive, but we haven't been raising children who can think and dream and maybe build something better than what we have. You're going to change that." That evening, as Clara and Gideon sat on their porch reading together, she felt a deep sense of settling into place. The community had tested her and found her worthy. More importantly, she was beginning to see how her skills and Gideon's could combine to create something neither could have built alone. "You know what I like about Elizabeth Bennet," Gideon said. "Closing the book for the night. What's that? She doesn't let anyone else define what she's worth, not her mother, not society, not even Darcy, until he proves he understands her value." He looked at Clara directly. "Reminds me of someone I know." Clara smiled, feeling her mother's ring catch the last rays of sunlight. "Keep reading, Cowboy. You haven't gotten to the good part yet." Clara first discovered Gideon's nightmares on a July evening when thunder rolled across the valley like cannon fire. She woke to find him rigid beside her, his breathing shallow and rapid, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. In his sleep, he muttered words she couldn't quite catch, fragments of orders and pleas that spoke of desperate situations and impossible choices. "Gideon," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "wake up." He came awake instantly, completely, the way a man learns to when staying alert means staying alive. For a moment, his eyes held no recognition, focused on some distant battlefield that existed only in memory. Then he saw her, and the tension slowly left his massive frame. "Sorry," he said roughly, sitting up and running his hands through his hair. "Did I wake you?" "The storm woke me," Clara lied gently. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Gideon said, but she could see he was anything but fine. "Just dreams. They'll pass." But they didn't pass. Over the following weeks, Clara learned to recognize the signs, the way he startled at sudden noises, the careful attention he paid to exits and approaches whenever they were in town, the haunted look that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. Something had happened to him before he came to the valley, something that left scars deeper than anything she could see. The answer came by accident on a sweltering afternoon in late July. Clara was organizing their belongings in the new house. Finally, complete enough to live in, when she knocked over a wooden box that had been stored under Gideon's side of the bed. The contents scattered across the floor, a few letters, some folded papers, and something that made her breath catch in her throat. Military medal, tarnished with age but still recognizable. The ribbon was faded blue and grey, and the inscription read, "For gallantry in action, Private First Class Gideon Lawson, 2nd Pennsylvania Infantry." Clara picked it up with careful fingers, understanding flooding through her. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way he sometimes seemed to be fighting battles only he could see. Gideon was a veteran of the war between the states. "You weren't supposed to see that," Gideon said from the doorway, his voice flat and distant. Clara turned to face him, the medal still in her palm. "How long did you serve?" 4 years. Bull Run to Appomattox." Gideon's jaw was tight, his eyes focused somewhere beyond her shoulder. Lost a lot of good men in those 4 years. Should have been one of them, probably. But you weren't, Clara said simply. You survived. You came home. Did I? The question came out raw, painful. Sometimes I'm not sure which world is real. This one, where I'm building a life with you, or the one where I'm still back there, still fighting, still watching friends die. Clara set the medal carefully on their dresser and moved to him. This, close, she could see the pain he carried, lines etched around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and memories too heavy to bear alone. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened." For a long moment Gideon was silent. Then slowly the story began to emerge. He'd been 19 when he enlisted, full of patriotic fervor and romantic notions about glory and honor. The reality of war had stripped those illusions away, faster than winter stripped leaves from trees. "Antietam was the worst," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 17,000 casualties in a single day. I was in the cornfield when the Confederate line broke. Should have been a victory, but all I could see were boys from Pennsylvania and boys from Virginia, bleeding their lives out into the dirt. Clara listened without interruption as he told her about friends lost to disease and bullets, about the impossible choices that war demanded, about the guilt that came with survival when so many others didn't make it home. He'd been decorated for bravery at Gettysburg, where he'd held a position against impossible odds, but the medal felt like mockery now. "I came west to get away from all of it," Gideon said. "Figured if I could build something good, something lasting, maybe I could balance the scales somehow, make up for—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Make up for surviving?" Clara asked gently. Gideon nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why me, Clara? Why did I get to come home when better men than me died in those fields? What right do I have to happiness when they'll never see another sunset?" Clara thought carefully before responding. This wasn't a question that could be answered with platitudes or easy comfort. This was a man grappling with the deepest questions of existence, wrestling with guilt that had shaped every choice he'd made for nearly 2 decades. "I think," she said finally, "that the men who didn't come home would want their sacrifice to mean something. They'd want the world they died for to be a better place, not a sadder one. By building a life here, by creating a community, by raising children who will never know that kind of war, you're honoring their memory in the best way possible. Some nights I can still hear them," Gideon admitted. "My sergeant, Bobby Morrison, he used to talk about the farm he was going to buy when the war ended, the children he was going to have. Got shot at Fredericksburg, died calling for his mother." He was quiet for a moment. "How do I build the life he'll never have without feeling like I'm stealing it?" "You build it big enough to include his memory," Clara said. "You name a field after him or teach his story to our children so they understand the cost of the peace they inherit. You don't dishonor the dead by refusing to live, Gideon. You dishonor them by wasting the life they died to preserve." That night, for the first time since Clara had known him, Gideon slept peacefully through a thunderstorm. But their conversation had opened something between them, a deeper understanding that would be tested sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, a stranger arrived at their door. A well-dressed man in his 50s with soft hands and calculating eyes. He introduced himself as Harrison Blackwood from Philadelphia, and he carried with him news that threatened to shatter the careful peace Clara had built. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I've come a long way to find you. There are people back home who are very concerned about your welfare." "People?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew. "Mr. Henderson, among others. He's authorized me to offer you safe passage back to Philadelphia, where a proper wedding and a respectable life await you." Blackwood's eyes swept over their half-finished homestead with obvious distaste. "Surely you can see that this," he gestured dismissively, "this primitive existence is no life for a woman of your education and breeding. Clara felt Gideon tense beside her, and she placed a warning hand on his arm. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, I've already chosen my life. I'm quite happy here." "Are you?" Blackwood's smile was cold. "Living in sin with a man whose past is, shall we say, questionable?" "Yes, Miss Whitmore. I've done my research on your frontier paramour. Did he tell you about his military service, about the things he did during the war?" "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I think you should leave." "Not until you've heard what Mr. Henderson is prepared to offer," Blackwood pressed. "A house in the finest district of Philadelphia, servants, social position, security for your future." "Everything except love," Clara interrupted. "Thank you, but no." As Blackwood finally departed, Clara watched him go with a growing sense of unease. His parting words echoed in her mind. "This isn't over, Miss Whitmore. A woman of your quality doesn't belong in this wilderness, and there are those who will go to great lengths to ensure you come to your senses." The bronze school bell arrived on a freight wagon 3 weeks after Harrison Blackwood's unwelcome visit, gleaming in the August sunlight like a promise made manifest. Clara stood in the doorway of their completed house, watching Gideon direct the delivery men with the careful attention he gave to all things that mattered deeply to him. "Where exactly did you order this?" Clara asked, running her fingers along. The bell's smooth surface, the craftsmanship was exquisite, far finer than anything she'd expected to see in their remote valley. "Denver," Gideon said, looking pleased with her obvious delight. "Had it specially cast. The inscription was my idea." Clara walked around the bell until she could see the words etched into the bronze. "Lawson Valley School. Clara's bell. Where? Learning lights the way home." Her throat tightened with emotion. "Gideon," she whispered, "figured if you were going to teach the valley children, you needed a proper bell to call them to learning," he said, suddenly looking uncertain. "Too much." Instead of answering, Clara stood on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and growing love into the gesture. When they broke apart, she saw that several of their neighbors had gathered to admire the bell, including Danny, Hartwell, and his younger sister Emma. "Does this mean school's really going to start?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "September 1st, Clara confirmed, "and this bell will ring every morning at 8 o'clock sharp to call you all to lessons. Even if it's raining," Danny wanted to know. "Even if it's raining," Clara assured him. "Rain never stopped learning, and it's not going to start now." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over their valley, Gideon surprised Clara with another gift, a small velvet box that he placed in her hands with uncharacteristic nervousness. "I know we've talked around this subject plenty," he said, his voice unusually formal, "but I figured it was time to make it official." Inside the box was a ring, not the elaborate diamond she might have expected from a suitor back east, but something far more meaningful. The band was crafted from gold that had been panned from their own creek, and set into it was a single stone that caught the evening light like captured starfire. "It's a sapphire," Gideon explained. "Found it myself in the mountains last spring. Had it cut and polished in Denver when I ordered your bell. Blue as the sky over our valley on a perfect day." Clara stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness behind it. This wasn't just a proposal, it was a declaration that he saw their love as something born from this place, as natural and enduring as the mountains themselves. "Clara Whitmore," Gideon said, dropping to one knee beside her chair. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and the mother of my children and my partner in building something that will last long after we're gone?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Yes, I'll marry you, Gideon Lawson. I'll be your wife and your partner and anything else this life requires." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand, which Clara realized it had been. Gideon had been planning this moment for months, crafting not just a proposal, but a symbol of their shared commitment to this place and each other. Word of their engagement spread through the valley faster than wildfire. And within days, neighbors began arriving with offers to help plan the wedding. Margaret Hartwell took charge of organizing the women, while Samuel and the other men started planning what they called a celebration worthy of Gideon finally settling down. October wedding, Margaret suggested, as the women gathered in Clara's kitchen for planning. After harvest is done, but before the weather turns. October sounds perfect, Clara agreed, though privately she wondered if they'd make it that long without facing whatever threats Harrison Blackwood had implied. Her concerns proved justified sooner than expected. 3 days after the engagement, Clara was working in her garden when she noticed dust rising on the eastern trail, too much dust for a single rider. As the group drew closer, she counted 5 men, well-armed, and riding with the purposeful pace of people on serious business. "Clara," Gideon called from the barn, his voice carrying a warning note. He'd seen them too. The lead rider was Harrison Blackwood, but the men with him were nothing like the soft-handed city man who'd visited before. These were hard cases, the kind of men who made their living with violence and intimidation. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood called as he dismounted, "I've brought some friends to help. You see reason. She's given you her answer," Gideon said, walking slowly from the barn. Clara noticed he was wearing his gun belt, something he rarely did around the house. "The answer of a woman who's clearly been isolated too long from civilized society," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Mr. Henderson is prepared to be very generous, Miss Whitmore. $5,000 for your safe return to Philadelphia, plus the wedding and household expenses." $5,000! One of his companions whistled. "Hell, Blackwood, for that kind of money I'd marry the lady myself." "The lady is already spoken for," Gideon said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made smart men step carefully. "By a washed-up soldier playing at being a rancher?" The speaker was a thin man with cold eyes and a gun that looked well used. "We checked into your background, Lawson. Gideon Big Jake Lawson, formerly of the 2nd Pennsylvania, decorated veteran of Gettysburg. Very impressive. But that was a long time ago and you're outnumbered." Clara saw something change in Gideon's expression, a hardening that reminded her of the man who'd emerged from nightmares, ready for battle. But before he could respond, more dust appeared on the western trail. Samuel Hartwell arrived first, followed by 3 other valley ranchers and their oldest sons. Within minutes, the odds had shifted decisively in their favor. More importantly, Clara realized that Gideon's reputation in the valley went beyond being a good neighbor. These men trusted him enough to ride armed to his defense without question. "Gentlemen," Samuel said mildly, "seems like you might have taken a wrong turn. This is private property, and the lady has made her position clear." Blackwood looked around at the assembled ranchers, clearly reassessing his situation. "This is between Mr. Henderson's representative and Miss Whitmore. You have no standing in this matter." "Wrong again," said Margaret Hartwell, who had appeared with 3 other valley women, all carrying rifles with the casual competence of people who'd learned to protect their homes. "Clara's going to be my neighbor and my friend. That gives me plenty of standing." For the first time since arriving, Blackwood looked genuinely uncertain. Whatever he'd been told about frontier life, he clearly hadn't expected to face an entire community united in Clara's defense. $5,000, he said again, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Think about what that could buy, Miss Whitmore. Security, comfort, respectability." "I have security," Clara said, looking around at the faces of her chosen community. "I have comfort in work that matters and love that's real. As for respectability," she held up her left hand, letting the sapphire catch the light, "I'm engaged to the finest man I've ever known. I don't need Mr. Henderson's money or his hollow promises." Blackwood's expression turned ugly. "This isn't over, Miss Whitmore. There are legal remedies available to concerned parties. Your family back east has rights." "My family is here," Clara said firmly. "These people are my family now." As Blackwood and his hired guns rode away, Clara felt Gideon's arm settle around her shoulders. The confrontation was over for now, but she suspected it was only the beginning. "Think they'll be back?" Samuel asked, watching the distant riders. "Count on it," Gideon replied. "Men like that don't give up easy when there's money involved." That night, as Clara and Gideon lay in bed, listening to the peaceful sounds of their valley, she found herself thinking about the school bell sitting in their yard, waiting to call children to learning. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching, starting the work that had brought her west in the first place. But now that work felt like part of something larger, not just educating children, but helping to build a community strong enough to protect what mattered most. "Gideon," she said quietly, promise me something. When they come back, and we both know they will, promise me you won't let them take me away from this. From you, from our life, from the children who need teaching." Gideon's arms tightened around her. "Clara, I promise you this. No man will take you from me while I have breath in my body. This is our home, our life, our choice. Anyone who wants to change that will have to go through me first." Outside their window, the bronze school bell gleamed in the moonlight, ready to call their valley to its future. Clara found the wanted poster. By accident, tucked between the pages of one of Gideon's older books, like a pressed flower from a garden she'd never want to visit. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible enough to make her blood run cold. Wanted, dead or alive. Gideon, Big Jake Lawson, member of the notorious Blackridge Gang. Reward, $2,000. Wanted for bank robbery, cattle rustling, and murder. Last seen territory of Wyoming, 1875. The drawing was crude but recognizable. The same strong jaw, the same intense eyes, though the face in the poster was harder, meaner than the man she'd come to love. Clara stared at the paper until the words blurred, her hands trembling, as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Everything he'd told her about coming west to build something lasting, about leaving his past behind, had it all been lies? Was the gentle man who read poetry and crafted school bells just another deception, another role played by someone whose real life was built on violence and theft? "Clara!" Gideon's voice came from the doorway, and she heard him stop short when he saw what she was holding. "Where did you find that?" "It fell out of your copy of Whitman," Clara said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "I was looking for something to read to the children tomorrow, and I found this." Gideon stood perfectly still, and Clara could see him calculating, deciding how much truth he could afford to tell. The realization that he was still keeping secrets, still deciding what she deserved to know, sparked anger alongside her shock. "How much of what you told me was true?" she asked, standing to face him. "The war service? The medal? All of it," Gideon said quietly. "Every word about the war was true. But you didn't mention the part about becoming an outlaw afterward." Gideon closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Clara saw pain that went deeper than anything she'd witnessed during his nightmares. "No, I didn't mention that." "Were you planning to mention it? Before we married, before I committed my life to a man who might have bounty hunters coming for him? Or were you going to let me find out when the shooting started?" "Clara, don't." Clara held up her hand, the sapphire engagement ring catching the afternoon light. "Don't tell me you were protecting me. Don't insult me with explanations about how you were going to tell me eventually. Just tell me the truth. All of it." Gideon sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking every one of his 40-odd years. "After the war, I came home to nothing. Farm was gone, family was dead, and nobody wanted to hire a soldier who'd spent 4 years killing instead of building. I drifted west, took work where I could find it, but decent jobs were scarce for men with no connections, and many rough edges." Clara listened without interruption, her anger warring with the part of her that still loved this man, despite everything. "I fell in with Jake Blackridge and his gang in '74. They weren't the worst outlaws in the territory, mostly cattle rustling and the occasional small-town bank. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get a stake together to start over legitimate." Gideon's voice was flat. matter of fact. But easy money has a way of making excuses for itself, and before I knew it, I'd been running with them for over a year. The murder charge? Bank job in Laramie went wrong. Guard went for his gun and Jake shot him down in cold blood. Gideon met her eyes directly. I didn't kill him, Clara, but I was there. In the eyes of the law, that makes me just as guilty. Clara absorbed this, trying to reconcile the man she knew with the criminal he was describing. How did you get away? From it? From them? Took my share of the Laramie job and rode out one night while they were drunk and celebrating. Changed my name from Jake to Gideon, close enough that I'd answer to it naturally, but different enough to throw off casual recognition. Came up here, bought this land with stolen money, and spent the last 8 years trying to build something clean enough to wash the blood off my hands. The honesty was brutal in its completeness, and Clara found herself almost wishing he'd continued. Lying. At least then she could have maintained the comfortable fiction that her life was built on solid ground instead of shifting sand. The neighbors, do any of them know? Samuel suspects something. He's never asked directly, but he's made it clear that whatever I was before doesn't matter to him as long as I'm a good neighbor now. Gideon leaned forward, his voice urgent. Clara, everything I've been to you, everything we've built together, that's real. That's who I am now. Is it? Clara stood up, pacing to the window to stare out at the valley that had become her world. Or are you still playing a role, still pretending to be someone you're not? I am who I choose to be, Gideon said firmly. Same as you chose to be a frontier teacher instead of a Philadelphia housewife. We're both different people than we were before we met. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through their conversation. Through the window she could see riders coming fast, not the measured pace of neighbors, but the urgent speed of men on serious business. How many people knew about that poster? Clara asked, sudden fear replacing her anger. Nobody, I thought. I'd destroyed... Gideon stopped, his face going pale. Jake Blackridge. If he's still alive, still running the gang, he'd have copies of all our wanted papers. And if someone's been asking questions about my past... The riders were close enough now to identify. 5 hard-faced men with the look of professional killers, led by someone Clara recognized with sick certainty. One of the men who'd ridden with Harrison Blackwood. They've found me, Gideon said, reaching for his gun belt. Blackwood must have hired bounty hunters to dig into my background. What does this mean? Clara asked, though she was afraid she already knew. It means the life we've been building is about to come under attack from people who won't be satisfied with just taking you away, Gideon replied grimly. It means Jake Blackridge and his gang are probably riding this way right now, looking to collect old debts and settle old scores. Through the window, Clara could see the riders had stopped at the edge of their property, studying the house and barn with professional interest. One of them held up a spyglass, examining their defenses. What do we do? Clara asked. Gideon was already moving, checking his weapons and gathering ammunition. We get ready for a fight. And Clara, he turned. To face her, his expression serious. You need to decide right now whether you're staying to fight beside the man I've become, or leaving with the bounty hunters to save yourself from the man I used to be. Clara looked at the wanted poster still clutched in her hand, then at the man she'd agreed to marry. The past he'd hidden was ugly, violent, built on choices that had hurt innocent people. But the man standing before her now was someone who'd spent 8 years trying to atone for those choices, building a life and a community that made the world a little better. She walked to the fireplace and threw the wanted poster into the flames. I'm staying, she said simply, but Gideon, when this is over, when we've dealt with whatever's coming, you and I are going to have a long conversation about honesty and trust and what it means to build a life together. Outside, the riders were moving closer, and in the distance, Clara could see more dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. Whatever was coming, it was going to be bigger than just bounty hunters looking for reward money. The real test of their love and their community was about to begin. Gideon's twin Colt 45s lay on their kitchen table like deadly promises, the metal gleaming dully in the lamplight. Clara had never seen him with both guns before. Usually he wore only one, and that mostly as a precaution against wild animals or the occasional drifter with bad intentions. These matched revolvers spoke of a different kind of preparation, a readiness for violence that made her stomach clench with fear. "I need you to understand something, Clara," Gideon said as he methodically cleaned and loaded each weapon. "Jake Blackridge isn't like the men who came with Blackwood. He's not looking for money or trying to intimidate you into leaving. He's coming to settle a score that's been eating at him for 8 years. "What kind of score?" Clara asked. Though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "When I left the gang, I took more than just my share of the Laramie job. I took information, names of people who'd helped us, locations of hideouts, details about jobs we were planning." Gideon's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the action on each revolver. "I never used any of it, never turned it over to the law, but Jake doesn't know that. Far as he's concerned, I'm a traitor who could destroy what's left of his operation any time I choose." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. "So this isn't just about capturing a wanted man for the bounty money. No, this is about eliminating a threat and making an example that'll keep other gang members from getting ideas about leaving." Gideon holstered both guns, the leather worn smooth from years of use. "Jake's not planning to take me back alive, Clara. He's planning to kill me, probably you too, and anyone else who gets in the way." Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses, but this time it was Samuel Hartwell and 3 other valley ranchers, all armed and grim-faced. "Gideon," Samuel called from outside, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed around their kitchen table was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. Without being asked, without any formal discussion, the men of their valley had decided to make Gideon's fight their own. More than that, they'd been quietly preparing for something like this for years. "We're not fools," Samuel explained, mapping out defensive positions on a piece of paper. "We knew you had a past that might catch up with you someday. Man doesn't choose to live alone in the mountains without good reason, but we also know who you've been to this community, and that's worth fighting for." "This could get ugly," Gideon warned. "Jake's gang has grown since I knew them. Could be 15, 20 men, professional killers, every one of them." "Then we'd better be smarter than they are," said Tom Mitchell, whose ranch lay to the south. "They'll expect you to run or hole up in your house and wait for them to come to you. What if we don't do what they expect?" Over the next several hours, Clara watched in amazement as these frontier ranchers planned a defense that would have impressed military strategists. They'd learned from the Indian Wars, from bitter experience with cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, and they'd been quietly organizing for years against the day when their isolated valley might face serious threat. Margaret Hartwell arrived with the other valley women, bringing food, medical supplies, and their own grim determination. "The children are all safe at the Morrison place," she reported to Clara. "Emma's in charge of the little ones, and the older boys are helping with the stock. Nobody's leaving the valley until this is settled." "Margaret, you should take Clara." "And get out of here," Gideon said. "This isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't," Margaret interrupted with language that would have scandalized her back in Philadelphia. "Clara's our teacher, and you're part of this community. Anyone who comes for you comes for all of us." As darkness fell, Clara found herself in the surreal position of learning to load and fire the Derringer pistol Gideon had pressed into her hands. "It's only got 2 shots, he explained, guiding her hands to the correct grip. "Don't waste them on anything beyond 10 feet, and don't hesitate if someone gets that close to you. This isn't about playing fair or giving warning. This is about staying alive." Clara's hands shook as she practiced the motion of cocking and firing, but she forced herself to concentrate. If Gideon was right about what was coming, her life might depend on her ability to use this weapon. "I never imagined," she said quietly, When I stepped off that stage in Denver, that I'd end up learning to shoot outlaws in defense of my home. Having second thoughts? Gideon asked, and she could hear the fear in his voice, not fear of the coming fight, but fear that she might finally decide he wasn't worth the danger he'd brought into her life. Clara looked around at their kitchen, where valley ranchers were planning strategy while their wives prepared bandages and ammunition. She thought about the school bell waiting in their yard, about the children who would never learn to read if she wasn't here to teach them, about the life she and Gideon were building together. No second thoughts, she said firmly. This is my home now, these are my people, and you're the man I love. Whatever comes, we face it together. The attack, when it came, arrived with the pre-dawn darkness that soldiers knew was the most disorienting time to strike. Clara woke to the sound of gunfire and Gideon's urgent voice calling her name. "They're here," he said, already moving toward the window with practiced efficiency. "Looks like Jake brought more men than we expected." Through the window, Clara could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, hear the whistling crack of bullets hitting wood and stone. The valley ranchers had positioned themselves well, using natural cover and prepared positions to create crossfire zones that made approaching the house costly for the attackers. But there were a lot of them, more than the 15 or 20 Gideon had estimated. "Gideon Lawson!" a voice called from the darkness, carrying clearly across the gunfire. "Jake Blackridge here. Been looking for you for 8 long years, you traitorous son of a bitch." "Still alive, Jake," Gideon called back. "Still disappointed about that? Won't be for much longer. You and that schoolteacher of yours are going to pay for the trouble you've caused me." Clara crouched by the window, her derringer clutched in both hands, watching Gideon return fire with the calm precision of a man who'd done this before. She realized that whatever else he might have been, her gentle giant was also a seasoned fighter who knew how to keep his head in battle. The siege lasted through the night, with the outlaws making several attempts to rush the house only to be driven back by the coordinated fire of the valley defenders. As dawn approached, Clara could see that they'd inflicted casualties on the attacking force, but they'd taken losses too. Tom Mitchell was wounded, and young Bobby Hartwell had taken a bullet in the shoulder. "They're going to try one more time," Gideon said, reloading his revolvers as grey light began to filter through the smoke. "Jake's not the type to ride away empty-handed, not after losing this many men." "How many are left?" Clara asked. 8, maybe 10, but they'll be desperate now, and desperate men are the most dangerous kind." As if summoned by his words, Jake Blackridge's voice rang out across the valley one more time. "Gideon, I'm done playing games. You come out and face me man to man, and I'll let the others live. Stay hiding behind them women's skirts, and I'll burn down every building in this valley." Clara saw Gideon's face set in lines of grim determination. She knew, with the certainty that comes from truly understanding someone, that he was about to do something heroic and probably stupid. "Don't even think about it," she said firmly. "Clara, no. We finish this together, or we don't finish it at all." Outside, she could hear Jake Blackridge ordering his remaining men to prepare for a final assault. The real battle was about to begin. Dawn broke over the valley, with the orange-red light of a world on fire. Clara crouched behind the overturned kitchen table, her small derringer pistol steady in her hands, despite the chaos erupting around their home. Through the shattered window, she could see Jake Blackridge leading his remaining men in what she knew would be their final assault. The outlaw leader was everything she'd expected and worse, a man whose face bore the marks of violence and hard living, whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd made killing his profession. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered, and Clara felt a chill of fear that went deeper than anything she'd experienced during the long night of siege. "There!" Gideon shouted, firing both Colts in rapid succession at figures moving through the morning shadows. "Samuel, they're trying to flank us from the barn." The coordinated defense that had served them so well during the night was beginning to break down under the pressure of desperate men making a final play. Clara could hear Samuel Hartwell returning fire from his position near the creek, but his shots sounded more scattered, less controlled than before. "Gideon!" Jake's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. "End this now! Come out and face! Me or I start putting bullets through windows until I hit something soft." A bullet shattered the window frame inches from Clara's head, sending splinters of wood flying. She pressed herself lower behind their makeshift barricade, acutely aware that the derringer in her hands contained only 2 shots, 2 chances to make a difference in a fight that had already claimed too many lives. "How many are left?" She called to Gideon, who was reloading behind the stone fireplace. 5, maybe 6, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. "But Jake's worth 3 men by himself, and he's got nothing left to lose." Another volley of gunfire erupted from outside, followed by the sound of splintering wood as bullets punched through their front door. Clara realized with growing horror that their defensive positions, which had seemed so solid in the darkness, were being systematically destroyed by men who knew how to fight and weren't afraid to die trying. "Clara?" Margaret Hartwell's voice called from somewhere outside. "The barn's on fire." Through the smoke-hazed air, Clara could see orange flames beginning to lick at the structure where Gideon kept his horses and equipment. The outlaws weren't just trying to kill them now. They were trying to destroy everything Gideon had built, leaving nothing but ash and ruin behind. "Bastards," Gideon muttered, his face darkening with rage. 8 years of work gone. "Buildings can be replaced," Clara said firmly, though her heart broke watching flames consume the barn where she'd spent so many peaceful afternoons learning to care for livestock. "We can't." A new sound cut through the chaos, the rapid drumming of hoofbeats approaching from the south. For a moment, Clara's heart leaped with hope that reinforcements had arrived. Then she saw Jake Blackridge's satisfied smile and realized the approaching riders weren't coming to help. "Insurance policy," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the gunfire. "Brought some friends from Colorado, just in case you valley folks prove tougher than expected." 8 more outlaws thundered into view, their horses foam-flecked from hard riding. Clara's hope crumbled as she realized they were now facing odds that no amount of courage or clever positioning could overcome. "That's it," Gideon said grimly, checking the loads in his revolvers one final time. "We're not walking away from this one." But before Clara could respond, another sound reached her ears, the deep, resonant toll of the bronze school bell that Gideon had commissioned for her. Someone was ringing it, sending its clear voice across the valley in the pattern that every frontier community knew, the call for help, the signal that brought neighbors running no matter the cost. "Danny," Clara whispered, understanding flooding through her. "Danny Hartwell's ringing the bell." The 16-year-old boy she'd been teaching to read was somewhere out there in the chaos, pulling on the bell rope with all his strength, sending the call for aid echoing across the mountains. It was a desperate gesture. Even if other communities heard the bell, they were hours away, far too distant to affect the outcome of this fight. But the sound had an unexpected effect on the attacking outlaws. Several of them hesitated, looking around nervously as the bronze voice continued its urgent tolling. Clara realized that men who lived by violence often developed superstitions about bells and churches and other symbols of the civilized world they'd abandoned. "Shut that damn noise up," Jake snarled at his men. "It's just a kid ringing a bell." But the momentary hesitation had given the valley defenders a crucial few seconds to reposition. Clara heard Samuel Hartwell's rifle speak from a new location, and one of the Colorado outlaws tumbled from his saddle. Then Jake Blackridge himself appeared at their shattered front door, his gun drawn and his face twisted with 8 years of accumulated rage. "Time to settle accounts, old friend," he said, his eyes fixed on Gideon. Clara saw Gideon's hands move to his revolvers, saw the deadly calculation in both men's faces as they prepared for the gunfight that would end this one way or another. But she also saw something Jake Blackridge couldn't see from his position in the doorway. One of his men moving through the smoke toward the window where she crouched, his rifle raised and aimed at Gideon's unprotected back. The derringer felt heavy in Clara's hands as she raised it, remembering Gideon's words. Don't hesitate if someone gets that close to you. The outlaw was less than 10 feet away, close enough that she couldn't miss, close enough to see the cold satisfaction in his eyes as he prepared to shoot the man she loved in the back. Clara pulled the trigger. The small gun's report was almost lost in the chaos of gunfire, but its effect was immediate. The outlaw with the rifle staggered, his shot going wide, his weapon clattering to the floor as he clutched his shoulder. In the same instant, Gideon and Jake Blackridge drew their guns, the two veteran killers moving with the deadly grace of men who'd survived more fights than they could count. Clara watched in frozen horror as the two Colts came up, as both men took aim, as the final moment of their long-delayed reckoning arrived with the inevitability of thunder after lightning. The school bell continued tolling, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a prayer, like a promise, like the sound of civilization refusing to be silenced by violence and chaos. The gunshots came so close together, they sounded like a single thunderclap. Clara watched in frozen terror as both Gideon and Jake Blackridge fired simultaneously, their weapons speaking with deadly finality across the smoke-filled room. For an endless moment, both men stood perfectly still, their guns extended, their faces locked in the concentration of mortal combat. Then Jake Blackridge's knees buckled, and he pitched forward onto their ruined kitchen floor, his revolver clattering away across the wooden boards. Gideon remained standing, but Clara could see blood spreading across his shirt, could see the way he favored his left side as he holstered his smoking Colts. He'd been hit, but he was alive. "Clara," he said, his voice rough but steady, "you all right?" Before she could answer, the remaining outlaws outside began shouting to each other, their voices carrying confusion and growing panic. Their leader was down. The fight had turned against them, and the bronze school bell continued its relentless tolling, calling the entire territory to witness their defeat. "Jake's dead," one of them called. "What do we do now?" "We get the hell out of here," another replied. "This whole valley's gone loco." Clara watched through the shattered window as the surviving members of the Blackridge gang began a fighting retreat, gathering their wounded and their dead as they fell back toward their horses. The coordinated assault had dissolved into chaos, each man now concerned only with saving his own skin. Samuel Hartwell appeared in their doorway, his rifle at the ready, his face grim with the aftermath of violence. "How bad?" he asked, looking at the blood on Gideon's shirt. "I'll live," Gideon replied, though Clara could see the pain he was trying to hide. "Jake won't be bothering anyone again," Samuel confirmed, looking down at the outlaw leader's still form. "That was some shooting, both of you, but Clara here saved your bacon. I saw her drop the one who was drawing down on you from the window." Clara looked at the derringer in her hands, smoke still wisping from its barrel. She'd actually shot a man, possibly killed him, and she felt strangely disconnected from the act. Later she knew the full weight of what she'd done would hit her. For now, there was only gratitude that Gideon was alive and the fight was over. "The others?" Gideon asked. "Running like scolded cats," Samuel said with grim satisfaction. "Lost their taste for fighting when their leader went down. Won't be back, I'd wager." Margaret Hartwell rushed in with her medical supplies, taking charge of Gideon's wound with the competent efficiency of a woman who'd patched up injuries before. As she worked, Clara found herself staring at the foundation stones of their house, the cornerstones that Gideon had laid with such care months ago, now chipped and scarred by bullet impacts but still solid, still standing. "It's not as bad as it looks," Margaret announced after examining Gideon's side. "Bullet went clean through, missed anything vital. You'll be sore for a few weeks, but you'll heal fine." Over the next hour, as the smoke cleared and the full extent of the damage became apparent, Clara began to understand how profoundly their lives had changed. The barn was a total loss. The house was damaged but repairable, and several of their neighbors had been wounded in the fighting. But they were alive. They were free, and the threat that had hung over their valley for 8 years was finally gone. "Danny!" Clara called as she saw the gangly teenager approaching from the direction of the school bell. "Are you hurt?" "No, ma'am," Danny replied, his face flushed with excitement and residual fear. "But I sure am glad that bell worked like you said it would. Figured if I kept ringing it long enough, somebody would hear." "Someone did hear," Clara said, pulling the boy into a fierce hug. "You may have saved all our lives." As the day wore on, neighbors continued arriving from across the valley and beyond, drawn by the bell's urgent summons. What they found was a community that had been tested by violence, but not broken by it. A group of people who had chosen to stand together against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. That evening, as Clara sat beside Gideon's bed helping him eat the soup Margaret had prepared, he reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious despite his obvious exhaustion. "What? Are you sorry about all of this, about what my past brought down on us?" Clara considered the question carefully, looking around at their damaged but still standing home. Through the bullet-scarred window, she could see neighbors working together to clean up the debris, planning the barn raising that would begin as soon as Gideon was well enough to help. The bronze school bell sat in their yard, untouched by the violence, ready to call children to learning when the new term began. "I'm sorry people got hurt," she said finally. "I'm sorry we lost the barn and that our neighbors had to risk their lives. But sorry that I chose this life with you? Never. Even knowing what you know now about who I was. Gideon, I fell in love with who you are, not who you were. Today proved that the man you've become is worth fighting for, worth believing in." She squeezed his hand gently. "Besides, I shot a man today. Guess that makes me an outlaw too." Despite his pain, Gideon smiled. "Reckon it makes you a woman who protects what matters to her." 2 days later, as Gideon was finally able to sit up without help, Samuel Hartwell arrived with news that put the final punctuation mark on their ordeal. "Got word from the territorial marshal," Samuel announced. "Seems Jake Blackridge had quite a price on his head, $5,000 dead or alive. The other members of his gang had bounties too. All told, there's near $8,000 in reward money coming to the valley." "Oh, we don't want blood money," Gideon said immediately. "Wasn't planning to keep it," Samuel replied with a grin. "Figured we'd use it to rebuild what got destroyed in the fighting. New barn for you, repairs on the other damaged buildings, maybe even a proper schoolhouse for Clara's teaching." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the gesture. These people had risked everything to defend her and Gideon, and now they wanted to use the rewards to rebuild their community even stronger than before. 3 weeks later, on a perfect October morning, with golden aspen leaves dancing in the crisp air, Clara and Gideon stood together before the same foundation stones that had weathered the gunfight. But this time, they weren't surveying damage. They were getting married. The entire valley had turned out for the ceremony, along with visitors from neighboring communities who'd heard the story of the schoolteacher and the reformed outlaw who'd found love in the wilderness. Reverend Morrison from the next valley over performed the service, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Do you, Gideon Lawson, take Clara to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Gideon said, his voice strong and sure despite the lingering stiffness from his wound. "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take Gideon to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Clara looked into the eyes of the man who'd saved her from a blizzard, taught her to shoot, and shown her what it meant to build something lasting with your own hands. "I do," she said, her voice carrying across the valley like the bronze school bell that had summoned help in their darkest hour. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was dancing on the wooden platform the men had built specially for the occasion, feasting on food the women had prepared for days, and toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the evening wore on. But Clara's favorite moment came near. Midnight, when she and Gideon slipped away from the celebration to stand alone beside the foundation stones of their home. The stones bore new scars from the gunfight, but they remained solid, unshakable, ready to support whatever they chose to build upon them. "No regrets?" Gideon asked, pulling her close. "Only one," Clara replied, snuggling against his warmth. "What's that? I wish my parents could have met you. They would have loved the man you've become." Above them, stars wheeled across the vast Montana sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the wilderness they'd chosen to call home. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of their rebuilt home, watching Gideon put the finishing touches on a baby's cradle. His hands moved with the same patient care he'd shown when crafting her school bell, each curve and joint shaped with love for the child who would soon sleep within its protective walls. "Almost finished," he said, running his palm along the smooth maple sides. "Just need to attach the rockers, and it'll be ready." Clara placed a protective hand over her swelling belly, feeling the gentle movement within that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Their child was due in the spring, and she couldn't help but marvel at how much their lives had changed since that snowy night when a desperate schoolteacher had chosen to trust a giant stranger in a storm. The valley had prospered in the months since the gunfight that had finally laid Gideon's past to rest. The new barn was larger and better designed than the old one, built with lumber donated by neighboring communities and labor provided by men who'd come to respect what Gideon and Clara were building together. The schoolhouse, a proper building now with glass windows and a bell tower, stood at the center of the growing settlement, its bronze bell calling children to learning every weekday morning. "Mrs. Lawson," a small voice called from the porch. "Are you ready for us?" Clara smiled at the title she still hadn't quite gotten used to, then opened the door to admit her afternoon reading group. 8 children of various ages clustered on the porch, clutching books and slates with the eager anticipation she'd learned to treasure above all else. Come in," she said, ushering them into the front room that had been carefully arranged. "For teaching. Danny, did you finish the Dickens chapter I assigned?" "Yes, Ma'am," the 17-year-old replied, his reading skills now advanced enough that he was helping teach the younger children. "But I had questions about some of the words." "Excellent. Questions mean you're thinking, not just reading." Clara settled into her teaching chair, marveling at how natural this felt, the blend of home and school, private life and community service that had become the rhythm of her days. As the children worked through their lessons, Clara noticed Gideon, listening from his workshop corner, occasionally looking up from the cradle to smile at a particularly clever answer or thoughtful question. He'd become part of the teaching process without either of them planning it, his practical knowledge complementing her formal education in ways that served their students well. "Mr. Gideon," asked 6-year-old Emma Mitchell, "how do you make the wood so smooth without any splinters?" "Same way you learn to read, without stumbling over words," Gideon replied, setting down his plane. "Practice, patience, and paying attention to what the material wants to teach you." The afternoon lesson continued with discussions ranging from arithmetic to geography to the philosophical questions that arose naturally when curious minds encountered great literature. Clara watched her students, some of whom had grown several inches since she'd first started teaching them, and felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. These children were growing up in a community that valued learning and thinking, where education was seen not as a luxury for the wealthy, but as a necessity for everyone who wanted to build something lasting. They would grow up literate, thoughtful, capable of dreams beyond survival and drudgery. When the lesson ended and the children scattered to their various homes and chores, Clara found herself alone with Gideon for the first time all day. He'd finished the cradle while she taught, and now he was testing the gentle rocking motion with the critical eye of a craftsman. "It's beautiful," Clara said, running her hand along the headboard where he'd carved their initials intertwined with vines and flowers. "Our child is going to love it," Our children, Gideon corrected with a smile. This cradle is built to last for generations. Figure we might as well get our money's worth out of it. Clara laughed, imagining a house full of little ones learning their letters at her knee and their practical skills from Gideon's patient hands. It was a vision that would have seemed impossible a year ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Gideon," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside his workbench, "do you ever think about how different things might have been if that blizzard hadn't trapped us together?" "Every day," he replied seriously, "but I try not to dwell on it. Man can drive himself crazy thinking about all the ways his life might have gone different." "I wasn't trapped in that storm," Clara said quietly. "I was rescued by it." That evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley they'd helped build, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. She'd come west as a single woman, seeking purpose in teaching other people's children. Now she was a wife, soon to be a mother, and the cornerstone of a thriving educational community that would shape the territory's future for generations. "Come, read to me?" she asked, handing Gideon the book that had become their evening tradition. He opened to their current chapter in David Copperfield, his reading now smooth and confident, his deep voice bringing Dickens' characters to life in their mountain valley. As he read, Clara felt the baby move restlessly within her, as if already eager to join the world where stories and learning and love were woven together into something stronger than any of them could have built alone. When Gideon finished the chapter and closed the book, Clara took his large hand and placed it over her belly. "Feel that?" she asked as the baby kicked. "Strong little one," Gideon said with wonder, as he did every time he felt their child move. "Going to be a fighter, just like his mother." "Or her father," Clara corrected. "Either way, this baby is going to grow up knowing what it means to be loved, protected, and educated. What more could any parent want?" Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, the bronze school bell caught the last rays of sunlight. Tomorrow it would ring again, calling children to learning, calling the community to another day of building something that would last. Clara Lawson, for she was fully that now, no longer the uncertain Eastern schoolteacher who'd stepped off a stage in Denver, closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of home. Wind in the aspens, the distant lowing of cattle, the contented breathing of the man who'd promised to build her a ranch and had given her a world instead. Sometimes the most unexpected shelter really did come from the most unlikely stranger. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to trust the storm, it carried you exactly where you belonged.